At the time of her death in Suite 1801 of the Drake Hotel, the wealthiest woman in America possessed less than 9,000 Zaos into her name. She was born a Rockefeller. Her father held sway over the world. Her husband owned the machinery that sustained America, and she had already buried 2 of her children before either had turned 5. How did the heir to the planet's first billionaire come to die alone in a hotel room, surrounded by a family she had barely communicated with for nearly a decade? Her name was Edith Rockefeller McCormick, and what she did to her 5 children, what she allowed to happen to them, what she forced them to endure, and what she kept from them until her final breath is among the most carefully buried tales of the entire Gilded Age. Over the coming 40 minutes, you'll discover why the death of her 4-year-old son in 1901 sparked a rumor so cruel that even her own father refused to repeat it. What she did inside a small Zurich clinic for 8 years, something her husband called an act of abandonment. And the secret she whispered about her youngest daughter, Math, the one she begged her brother to enter alongside her. What you are about to hear is not a story about money. It's a story of what happens when wealth grows so vast that it stops protecting you and starts consuming those you love. And it begins with a single promise Edith made to herself when she was 6 years old. A promise that would destroy each one of her children. The year was 1878. Inside a modest brick house on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, a girl of 6 absorbed a lesson she would carry forever. Her father, John D. Rockefeller, sat across from her at the kitchen table. He was 41, and within a decade he would become the richest man in the world. Yet on that evening, he was teaching his 4th daughter to count pennies. He slid a small pile of coins across the wooden surface. He instructed her to divide them, 1 share for spending, 1 for saving, 1 for the church. He watched as her small fingers slid each coin with a banker's gravity. When she finished, she looked up, and her next words froze him in place. "Feather, when I am grown, I shall never count pennies. I will count only what I give." John D. Rockefeller said nothing. He simply stared at his daughter. This child who already sensed in some way that she was different, that she would never remain small, that she would never go unnoticed. And here's the detail historians often overlook. During that very week, her father had just signed the agreement that would create Standard Oil. Edith didn't know. Yet the world she stood to inherit was being built around her in real time. She was the 4th of 6 Rockefeller children. Although only 4 would live, her older sister Alice had died in infancy before Edith drew her first breath. Her sister Bessie was distant and studious. Sister Alta was the favored one, and her younger sibling John Jr., the only male heir, stood to inherit everything. Edith occupied the middle ground, the strange one, the child her mother, Laura Celestia Spellman, considered too clever for her own good. Her education took place entirely at home. She never set foot in a finishing school. Balls were forbidden to her. By 12, she was reading Latin, Greek, and German. She memorized the Old Testament, and she developed a habit her father found troubling. She started collecting objects, not playthings or dolls, symbols, ancient Egyptian coins, carved Chinese jade, a tiny Etruscan figure her father bought for her in New York, one she kept in her pocket for the next 40 years. She was building a museum inside her own mind, and she was already preparing herself, though no one could yet see it, for a life that would unfold almost entirely within that mind. For at some point between her 10th and 15th years, Edith Rockefeller began to hold a belief about herself she would never share with her parents, a conviction that would eventually carry her 3,000 miles away from her own children. She was 23 when she met Harold Fowler McCormick. It happened in the spring of 1895. Harold descended from a separate American dynasty. His father, Cyrus McCormick, had invented the mechanical reaper, the very device that fed 19th century America. The McCormicks represented entrenched Chicago wealth. The Rockefellers embodied new petroleum riches. Their alliance would not be simply a wedding. It would amount to a merger of two of the largest fortunes the nation had ever produced. The ceremony took place on November 26, 1895 at the Rockefeller Estate in Pocantico Hills, New York. Edith wore a white silk gown imported from Paris. Her veil was made of Brussels lace. Her bouquet held orchids transported by a private railway car from a Florida hothouse owned by Henry Flagler. No guests beyond family were present. The combined fortunes of both families on that wedding day, adjusted to modern currency, exceeded $23 billion, and fewer than 30 people occupied the room. The newlyweds spent their first 2 years in a modest home in Council Bluffs, Iowa, where Harold was learning the family business. Edith, a young woman raised in palaces, managed her own ledgers, tended her own garden, and delivered her first child in an upstairs bedroom. He was named John Rockefeller McCormick, arriving in March 1897. He bore his grandfather's name, and from the moment his eyes opened, his grandfather adored him. The family later moved to Chicago, and Edith's true life began. By 1901, the McCormicks had become the most influential young couple in the city. They hosted legendary dinners. They underwrote the first opera house Chicago would ever have. They acquired paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, jewels. Edith commissioned table linens embroidered by Belgian nuns and silverware, engraved with the family crest by a Florentine artisan. By 1905, she had given birth to 4 more children. Harold Fowler Muriel, Editha, Metheld. 5 children, 2 dynasties, a single union that on paper appeared perfect. Within 3 years, 2 of those children would be beneath the ground. Within 2 decades, the marriage would dissolve. Within 3 decades, the empire would vanish. Yet in the spring of 1905, none of that doom had yet unfolded. During that season of 1905, Edith Rockefeller McCormick stood atop a marble staircase in her newly built Lakeshore Drive mansion, looked down at her 4 living children, playing on the carpet below, and held the genuine conviction that she had been divinely chosen. Certain accounts suggest that by this time she had started a private diary. Within its pages, she wrote the date, the weather, and a single sentence. Today, I possess everything a woman could possibly desire. She would never write those words again. To understand the woman Edith Rockefeller became at her peak, one must understand Villa Turicum. In 1908, she and Harold acquired 300 acres of lakefront land along Lake Michigan in Lake Forest, Illinois. They hired architect Charles A. Platt to design a country estate in the style of an Italian Renaissance palazzo. It would have 40 rooms, 15 baths, Tuscan marble, a private theater, a formal Italian garden sloping down to the lake, and a swimming pool fed by spring water. The construction cost in 1908 reached $3 million, adjusted for inflation roughly $100 million today. She would live in it for less than a single full summer. After 1913, Villa Turicum stood largely vacant. After her death, it was abandoned. By 1950, it had fallen into ruins. By 1956, bulldozers leveled it completely. On that May afternoon in 1912, when Edith Rockefeller McCormick first walked through the front entrance of her personal palace, children trailing behind, husband at her side, 28 household staff arranged in the foyer to greet her. She had reached a height few women in human history have ever touched. She had married the most powerful young industrialist in the country. She had given birth to 5 children. She had built the largest private residence on the Great Lakes. She possessed everything. Yet a photograph survives from that summer of 1912. It shows Edith in the formal garden at Villa Turicum, dressed in white, her 4 surviving children gathered around her. Fowler 14, Muriel 10, math. And directly at the front, a child's arms wrapped around her mother's leg. Yet there is no fifth child. Editha had been dead 8 years. In the image, no one is smiling. What no historian has fully explained is why in nearly every family portrait taken at Villa Turicum after 1904, Edith arranged her living children in exactly the same way. Fowler always at her right side, Muriel always on her left, Mild always at her feet, and always an empty space immediately next to her where Editha would have once stood. It took 12 years of intervention from her psychiatrist before she could be persuaded to move that empty space out of each family picture. By that time, Edith had acquired a new obsession, a tiny object she carried in her handbag, wherever she traveled, an item she would in 1923 publicly claim she remembered possessing 3,000 years before her birth. Before continuing, one essential truth about Edith Rockefeller McCormick must be understood. She did not see herself as a creature of her own time. She believed, well ahead of her psychiatrist's confirmation, long before the newspapers mocked her, that her soul had passed through many lives, that she had ruled as a queen in Egypt, that she had walked through Babylon's gardens, that at her deepest core she was ancient, and the coming decade would test that belief in ways no earthly fortune could prepare her for the fall of 1900 marked the happiest period of Edith Rockefeller's life. She was 28. She lived in a townhouse at the corner of Erie Street and State, in Chicago's most fashionable district. 5 years of marriage lay behind her. She had 2 children, a strong son, named John, who had recently turned 3, and an infant son named Harold Fowler. Then, learning to walk, her husband returned each evening for dinner at 7000. Her father wrote her letters every Sunday. Her brother John Jr. traveled from New York twice a year, always bringing toys for the boys. By Rockefeller standards, the household was modest, only 9 staff, a French cook, an Irish nursemaid named Margaret, who had cared for John since his birth, and who, as the family would later testify, loved that small boy as if he were her own flesh. John had his grandfather's russet hair. He had his father's quick laugh. He could already name every animal in his picture book in English, in German, and even a few French words. Both the Rockefellers and the McCormicks considered him the most remarkable child either lineage had ever produced. In late September of that same year, Edith hosted a small birthday party for him. He had just turned 3½. Though the family followed the custom of marking the occasion every 6 months. For, as Harold would later describe in a letter, the boy is so quick that no single year seems enough to contain him, and there is one detail about that celebration that nearly no historian has recorded. Harold did not stay the entire evening. Once the cake was served, he left alone by carriage for a downtown engagement. He refused to elaborate to his wife. It would not be the last time. By the end of 1900, Edith was carrying her 3rd child. By January, she was decorating the nursery in pink. She felt certain in some inexplicable way that this one would be a daughter. It started with a rash on his throat. The date was the morning of February 24, 1901. John was playing on the rug in the upstairs parlor when his nurse, Margaret, noticed 3 tiny red spots under his right ear. She did not panic. Children of that age broke out in rashes constantly. She took him to the bathroom, washed his neck with cold water, and dressed him in a soft nightgown. By evening, the rash had spread across his chest. By the next morning, it had climbed to his face. The family physician, Dr. Gonzalez, the most respected pediatrician in the city, arrived shortly before noon on February 25. He took one look at the boy, turned to Edith, and spoke the 2 words every mother in 1901 feared: scarlet fever. In 1901, scarlet fever killed about 1 in every 4 American children who caught it. Antibiotics didn't exist. No vaccine was available. No treatment existed beyond cold compresses, quiet rooms, and prayer. The combined Rockefeller and McCormick fortunes, the greatest reservoir of private wealth in human history, up to that point could buy anything in the world. They could not buy a cure for strep. Over the next 11 days, Edith never left her son's bedside. She would not sleep in her own room. She refused to eat at the table with her husband. She moved the nurse Margaret into the bedroom adjoining John's. And she sat there hour after hour, day after day, holding the small hand of a boy whose fever climbed to 105 and would not break. Telegrams flew to Cleveland, to New York, to every infectious disease specialist on the East Coast. 3 doctors traveled from Johns Hopkins on a private railway car. A Boston expert braved a snowstorm. Not one could make a difference. On the morning of March 2nd, 1901, John Rockefeller McCormick, aged 3 years and 11 months, opened his eyes one last time. He looked up at his mother, and according to the Irish nurse Margaret, who would tell this story to her dying day, he spoke a single word, "Mama." He died that afternoon at 3:47. Here is the part that every biographer rushes past. To understand how Edith Rockefeller comported herself in the days that followed, and why those days would eventually destroy her marriage, alienate her father, and drive her 3,000 miles across an ocean. One must consider what was already happening inside her own body that week. She was 4 months pregnant, and upon being told her son had died, she rose from the bedside chair, walked into the next room, and collapsed to the floor. The doctors who tended her that night wrote in their charts, something that the family later asked to be removed from the official records, a note about the way she kept repeating a single phrase over and over in a voice no longer quite her own. He will be Khufu. Khufu was the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid. That night she made a decision she would never undo. She removed every photograph of her boy from every wall in the house. She wrote his name on the back of each, and she placed them all, together with the tiny Egyptian carvings she had collected since childhood, inside a single locked cedar chest she would carry for the next 31 years to every home she ever lived in, including at the end Suite 1801 of the Drake Hotel. To the outside world, nothing changed. Edith Rockefeller McCormick posed for cameras at the Chicago Symphony a month after her son's death. She was photographed at a charity gala in May. She appeared in pictures at her brother's wedding in October. She dressed in black for 13 months. She was always smiling. In private, she had begun reading. She devoured the Egyptian Book of the Dead. She consumed the Tibetan Book of the Dead. She studied Madame Blavatsky, Karl Duprel, and the pioneering German theosophists. She wrote letters to a London occultist asking about the doctrine of metempsychosis, the passage of souls. She was searching for a doorway, a way to get her son back. In November 1901, she gave birth to her 3rd child, a daughter. She named her Muriel, borrowed from a figure in a romantic poem. Yet also she would later confess to her psychiatrist, taken from the Egyptian term Mary, meaning beloved. She did not put the newborn in the nursery John had once occupied. That room she had permanently closed. This is the moment requiring your closest attention for what Edith Rockefeller McCormick was beginning to do quietly, secretly behind the locked doors of one of the wealthiest homes in the country, was to build a parallel inner life, an alternate world, a realm her husband would never be allowed to enter, a realm that 2 decades later he would publicly blame for ruining their marriage. Yet John Rockefeller McCormick would not be the last child Edith was to lose. 3 years later, in the spring of 1904, a second tiny coffin would be carried from the Chicago home, and the newspapers of that era, the same press that loved nothing more than a Rockefeller scandal, would refuse, for reasons never fully explained, to publish a single word about it. She was named Editha, ending with an A. Edith herself chose the spelling. She told her husband that she wanted the girl to carry her name forward, but with an extra element, something her own mother had not given her. Edith McCormick was born on December 17, 1903. She had her father's cerulean eyes and her mother's small, delicate hands. Her weight was 7 lb. By her first Christmas, she had become the most photographed infant in all Chicago. The McCormick home received gifts from the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, along with a personal silver rattle sent by the wife of President Theodore Roosevelt. She lived only 8 months. The infant mortality rate among American children in 1904 was about 120 per 1,000 live births within the Rockefeller and McCormick families. By that same year, the rate reached 400 per 1,000. 2 of Edith's first 4 children would never see a 5th birthday. The cause of Editha's death was never publicly recorded. The death certificate filed in Cook County on August 19, 1904, lists the cause as natural causes infantile. No doctor's name appears beside the entry. The space for the attending physician is blank. This is unusual. In the Chicago of 1904, the death of an heir to 2 of the nation's largest fortunes would have been attended by no fewer than 3 doctors, and the document would bear all their signatures. No signature exists. Editha McCormick's death certificate bears no signature at all. This is what almost no account of Edith Rockefeller McCormack has ever examined. Editha did not die in the family townhouse. She did not die in a hospital. She died in a small, secluded cottage set on the grounds of a rural property 40 miles north of Chicago. A cabin built 6 weeks earlier on Edith's express order, called by the household staff the Quiet House. What was the Quiet House? According to a memo written by the house steward, found in the McCormick family archives during the 1980s. It was a low building where the youngest child can be cared for without disturbance, consistent with Mrs. McCormick's belief that the child requires complete stillness for her temperament. In other words, Editha had been separated from the main house. She had been placed with 2 nurses and a doctor in a secluded cottage on a private estate, and she had died there. The newspapers of early August 1904, the same papers that had exhaustively covered John Rockefeller McCormick's death 3 years earlier, printed almost nothing about Editha. The Chicago Tribune gave her a single paragraph on page 11. The New York Times gave a single sentence. No funeral photos were taken. No public service occurred. She was buried in Tarrytown in the same cemetery as her brother John inside a coffin, so small that the gravediggers later remarked it could have passed for a hat box. The reason for the press's refusal to publish more details about Edith McCormick, the reason why the era's most voracious sensation seekers fell suddenly silent upon the death of a Rockefeller child, was a phone call, a single call made by John D. Rockefeller personally during the afternoon of August 20th, 1904 to the owners of every major newspaper east of the Mississippi. He wanted this story not to be printed, and no one dared defy John D. Rockefeller in 1904. What he concealed remains to this day a matter of speculation. Yet the house steward's note contains one final line written 6 weeks prior to Editha's transfer to the Quiet House, a line that has haunted every researcher who has ever read it. Mrs. McCormick has expressed concern that the child does not respond to her presence in the way the others did, and Miss Edith would later write to her psychiatrist. Letters that have never been published, that remain under seal in a private Zurich archive, still reportedly contain her own admission about what she did or failed to do in the weeks before her daughter's death. She shed no tears at Editha's funeral. She did not approach the gravesite for 13 years. The household staff at the McCormick mansion later recalled that in the autumn of 1904, Edith Rockefeller McCormick stopped speaking for nearly 6 weeks. She communicated only through written notes. She ate her meals alone. She refused to enter the nursery where her 2 living children, Fowler 6 and Muriel 2, slept. Her hair, once chestnut brown, began graying at the temples. She had reached 32 years. A domestic servant named Bridget O'Connor, in service from 1903 to 1908, gave a sworn statement years later in connection with a probate dispute. In it, she described Edith Rockefeller McCormick's appearance during the winter after Edith's death. She said, "The mistress wore the same black dress for 40 days. I kept count. The lace at the cuffs started fraying. She forbade us to remove it from her, even for washing. She said the dress had been near the child. In the spring of 1905, despite the clear warnings of 2 physicians, she became pregnant a 5th time. The pregnancy was difficult. She remained bedridden for the final trimester. She refused her husband Harold entry to the bedroom. She insisted that the baby be delivered by a midwife rather than a doctor. She required the room to be filled with white flowers, gardenias, specially flown from a Florida hothouse, and that no male except the obstetrician be allowed in during the labor. Mathilda Dia McCormick arrived on August 8, 1905. She was healthy, with her mother's fair complexion and her father's sturdy build. She would live to be 42. Yet Edith had now undergone 5 pregnancies in 8 years and had buried 2 children, and something within her, something her brother John Jundard would later describe as the ordinary bond between a mother and her living children, had broken in a way that money could not fix. She began spending increasingly long periods alone in her library. She began exchanging letters with scholars in Vienna, Munich, Zurich. She began sending telegrams in code, and for the understanding of what followed to understand why in the fall of 1913, Edith Rockefeller McCormick boarded a steamer bound for Europe with her 3 surviving children and did not return to the United States for nearly 8 years. One must bring forward a figure whose name almost no Rockefeller historian is comfortable citing, a man whom Edith, in private correspondence, called the only healer of the human soul I have ever encountered. His name was Carl Gustav Jung, and what really happened in that small lakeside clinic in KU Snacht, Switzerland, between 1913 and 1921. What Jung wrote about Edith in his clinical notes. What Edith revealed during 8 years of treatment. What the staff at Zurich's Hotel bore alack murmured about the American heiress in Suite 308. All of it began to seep out decades later in the testimony of a single servant who had traveled with her. She sailed for Switzerland on October 11, 1913. To her husband, she called it a period of rest. She did not return for 7 years and 10 months. She took with her son Fowler, 15, daughter Muriel, 11, daughter Mathilde, 8 steamer trunks, the small cedar chest, holding John's pictures and her Egyptian relics, a lady's maid, a governess, a French cook, and 40,000 in gold. She rented rooms at the Hotel Lac in Zurich, Suite 308. She would live in those rooms for the next 8 years. She enrolled her children in Swiss boarding schools and enrolled herself in Carl Jung's seminars on analytical psychology. Here the story turns from private grief into public scandal for what Edith Rockefeller McCormick was about to do. What she would announce openly in newspaper interviews between 1916 and 1921 would turn her, by the time she finally returned to America, into the most ridiculed woman of her social class in the entire English-speaking world. In 1915, while speaking with a Swiss journalist, she claimed that through Jungian analysis she had recovered clear, detailed memories of 3 previous lives. She had been an Egyptian queen called Ankhesenamun, wife of King Tutankhamun. She had lived as the young wife of a Babylonian prince, and in her most recent, previous incarnation, she had been a Renaissance noblewoman in Florence who had died giving birth to twin sons. The American press, which had watched her European stay from a respectful distance, exploded. The Chicago Daily News ran the headline, "Rockefeller Heiress claims she was Egyptian queen." The New York World called her the costliest madwoman in modern history. Her father, John D. Rockefeller, by then the world's richest man, and a deeply devout Baptist, declined all comment. Yet in a private letter to her son found after his death, he wrote a single sentence, "I am ashamed before God by what my daughter has become." She remained abroad, and the journalistic humiliation following each public utterance was bewilderingly only the prelude. For in 1917, as she sat in Suite 308 of the Bora-Lac, a servant delivering messages to callers on the symbolic meanings of ancient Egyptian burial rites, her husband Harold, left alone in Chicago, was beginning an affair so reckless, so blatant, and so financially ruinous that it would eventually swallow nearly half of the McCormick fortune. Her name was Ganowalska. She was 29 years old. She came from Poland. By every recorded account, she had one of the most remarkably mediocre voices ever to aspire to an operatic career. And Harold McCormick, heir to the international harvester dynasty, Edith Rockefeller's husband, father of 3 surviving children, fell so completely in love with her that over the next decade he would spend the modern equivalent of over $100 million trying to make her a star. He paid for her vocal training, bought her stage costumes, bought opera houses for her to perform in, bribed conductors, bribed critics, bribed audiences. When the Chicago Opera Company refused to cast her as the lead in Leoncavallo's Zaz in 1920, Harold McCormick personally guaranteed the company's losses for the entire season and forced the role on them himself. The premiere was a disaster. The house laughed out loud. The critics destroyed her in the next day's papers. Harold married her anyway. Edith Rockefeller McCormick filed for divorce on December 29, 1921. The proceedings took less than 4 hours. Harold Fowler McCormick married Ganowalska in a civil ceremony in Zurich exactly 2 weeks later. Edith attended the wedding. She was dressed in black, and those engagements Harold had been secretly slipping away to attend 2 decades earlier, even as his young son was learning animal names in 3 languages. Those appointments, the house steward would later confirm in a confidential note, had been the beginning of Harold McCormick's lifelong inability to stay in any room that held his wife. He had been running from her throughout the entire marriage. The divorce was settled quietly. Edith received about $5 million, a fraction of her rightful share. She raised no objection. According to the lawyers who handled the matter, she didn't even read the papers before signing them. She had reached 49, had been married for 26 years. She had lost 2 children, and the husband she had lost was already. On the day the ink dried on the divorce papers, lying in another woman's bedroom 3 floors above in that same hotel bore a lack and the secret fixation she had carried since girlhood, the obsession her parents were never allowed to see, the compulsion that had driven her 3,000 miles across the sea, had by 1921 grown into the center of her entire being. She no longer merely believed she had once been Queen Ankhesenamun. She knew it with the same certainty other women held for the names of their own children. Yet, if you think this is the most painful part of Edith Rockefeller's story, you are not ready for what comes next, for what happened in 1922, the year she finally returned to America. The year she walked into the abandoned grandeur of Villa Turicum for the first time in 9 years is the part of her life that her descendants still refuse to discuss openly. It begins with her youngest child, Mathilde. It begins with a Swiss riding instructor, and it begins with a number 32. Mathilde McCormick was 16 when she met him. She had been raised in Switzerland, spoke 4 languages, and was educated at one of the continent's most exclusive finishing schools. By every contemporary account, she was a serious child, quieter than older sister Muriel, more studious than brother Fowler, and so fiercely attached to her mother that the Bar-a-Lac household staff called her the Shadow. That summer of 1922, in the alpine village of Pontresina, Mathilde was sent for riding lessons. Her instructor was a Swiss horseman named Max Ozer. He was 48. The age difference between Mathilde McCormick and Max Ozer was 32 years. He was older than her own mother. He was older than her father. By the time Mathilde turned 18 in August 1923, Max Ozer had reached 50 and had 2 grown children of his own. Their engagement was announced in February 1923. The global press exploded. The New York Times ran the story on its front page for 9 consecutive days. The London Daily Mail sent 3 correspondents to Switzerland. The Chicago Tribune, which had once been forbidden by John D. Rockefeller from publishing the death notice of Edith's daughter, Editha, now devoted entire pages to mocking the engagement of her surviving daughter. Mathilde was called the heiress who fell for her stable hand. Max Ozer was called the most expensive riding instructor in European history, and Edith Rockefeller McCormick. The matriarch had spent 8 years in Zurich supposedly mining her own psyche for the wisdom of past lives. Gave the union her full public support. The press blackout that had once protected the death of Edith's youngest daughter in 1904 had by now completely vanished. John D. Rockefeller had turned 84 in 1923. He no longer called press barons. He no longer controlled the printed word about his own family. Thus the world saw for the first time in full and uncensored detail what was happening to the children of Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Mathilde and Max Ozer married on April 12, 1923, in a small civil ceremony in Lausanne. Edith attended. She gave the bride a wedding gift of 1,000 million, along with a small turquoise scarab beetle she had carried in her handbag since 1900. Mathilde would later tell her own daughter born in 1925 that she had not understood the meaning of that gift until she reached adulthood. By that time her mother lay in the grave. The snorts, the aspect of the Mathilde saga that almost no historian has adequately addressed, is this Max Ozer was no fortune hunter. By every surviving account, he was a soft-spoken and devoted husband. Together, they would have a single daughter. The marriage lasted 6 years until Max's death from a heart attack in 1929. Mathilde was a widow at 24. She would never remarry. She would outlive her mother by only 15 years. She died in 1947 at 42 from complications related to depression and alcoholism, the same age. Give or take a year, that her mother had been when Mathilde first introduced Max Ozer to her on an alpine bridle path. Edith returned to Chicago in August 1921, 2 months before her divorce was finalized. Her absence had lasted nearly 8 years. Villa Turicum, the Italian-style palazzo she had built on the Lake Michigan shore in 1908, had stood empty throughout her entire exile. The marble had cracked. The fountains filled with leaves. The manicured gardens had grown wild. Only 3 of the original 20 servants remained on the grounds. The rest had been dismissed years before. She moved into a smaller house on Lakeshore Drive in the city. She had entered her 49th year. No husband remained to her. 2 of her children were in the ground. Son Fowler had married and lived in New York. Daughter Muriel remained single and traveled through Europe. Daughter Mathilde in Switzerland, preparing for a wedding the whole world mocked. Edith found herself for the first time in her adult life. Alone, she did not retreat quietly. From 1922 through 1929, she became one of the most aggressive cultural patrons in American history. She founded the Chicago Civic Opera Company. She funded an entire pavilion at the Field Museum dedicated to Egyptian antiquities. She financed the first English translation of Carl Jung's Psychological Types and sent copies to every major American university. She bought and renovated a townhouse on East Lake Shore Drive that became one of the city's most intellectually vibrant salons. She hosted weekly dinners attended by writers, artists, thinkers, and visiting Europeans. She lectured in public forums on metempsychosis, on dream symbolism, on the sacred meaning of the scarab, and here is what almost every Rockefeller biography refuses to acknowledge. The driving force behind Edith Rockefeller McCormick's emergence during the 1920s as one of the most generous and visible patrons in the nation's cultural life was not generosity. It was grief she was building before the public, and at enormous expense the same parallel inner world she had begun constructing in secret. After her son's death in 1901, she was building a museum of meaning, a memorial, a pyramid. She was preparing herself. Just as the Egyptian pharaohs she had studied for 3 decades had once prepared themselves for her own departure, and the concern that her father, John D. Rockefeller, had once murmured about in his old age, in a private letter to his son. The reason he called the curse of the brilliant Rockefeller daughters was now, by 1928, beginning to unfold exactly as he had feared. In the spring of 1932, Edith Rockefeller McCormick was diagnosed with cancer. She was 59. The disease had started in the breast and spread to the bones. The pain, by every report from her attending physicians, was severe. She refused morphine for the first 3 months, partly from a reluctance to dull her mind, and partly, as she confided in a letter to her psychiatrist, because she considered suffering a final teacher. She moved into the Drake Hotel on Lakeshore Drive in May of 1932. She took suite 1801 on the 18th floor, overlooking the very lakefront where she had once owned 300 acres. She entered no hospital. She did not return to Villa Turicum. She sent no word to her surviving children. What makes the final months of Edith Rockefeller McCormick's life almost unbearable to read, even after 9 decades, is this: she had given roughly $35 million to charitable, educational, and cultural causes over her lifetime. By the summer of 1932, secluded in her hotel room at the Drake, she had less than $100,000 in liquid assets. The Great Depression had wiped out nearly every remaining investment. Technically, she was nearly penniless. The nation's richest woman paid her hotel bills week to week. In July 1932, her brother John D. Rockefeller Jr., the only family member she had remained close to throughout her life, boarded a private railway car in New York and traveled to Chicago. He had seen 58 winters. He had been struggling with a serious respiratory illness for nearly a year. His doctors had advised against travel. He came anyway. He sat beside her bed in suite 1801 of the Drake Hotel for 3 full days. What passed between them has never entered public records. Yet in the Daily Register, John Jr. kept throughout his life, a volume now housed in the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. There is a lone entry dated July 18, 1932. It contains only a single sentence. That sentence reads, "She asked me to forgive her. I told her there was nothing to forgive. She didn't believe me, and neither did I." She died at Forside 23 in the afternoon on August 25, 1932. The date fell 6 days short of her 60th birthday. The official cause was carcinoma. The attending physician of record was Dr. Alfred Saint. The only family member in the room at the moment of death was her son Fowler, who had traveled from New York the night before. Her final recorded words, as noted by her nurse, were in a language the nurse could not understand. She transcribed them phonetically. A specialist in ancient languages, hired by the Rockefeller estate 3 weeks, later identified the phrases as Middle Egyptian. They were a passage from the Book of the Dead, specifically spell 30b. The incantation spoken by the deceased to ensure that the heart would not bear witness against the spirit at the final judgment. The fragment translates roughly, "O heart of my mother, rise not against me as a witness." When the maid entered Suite 1801, the next morning to pick up the belongings, she found 3 items on the night table, a comic 3 taken. Night on Rockefeller, a 1:30 of the heavens article into the red at her wedding, and an identicals moth. Her one sub hunt for her movement in Edith's hand, addressed to her brother, not involved in the voice to her one she is the photo thumbs in right tonight. Leave my telling more revenue friend the fair I just there refrain of his. That letter has never been published. Its existence, however, is recorded in the official estate inventory of the McCormick estate. According to that inventory, the note consisted of 4 sentences, and the final sentence contained a request that the cedar chest she had carried for 31 years be buried with her, sealed, and that no one, her brother included, be allowed to look inside it. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. honored that request. The trunk lies buried with her in Tarrytown, New York, next to the graves of her children, John and Editha. Its contents have never been inventoried. Some of Edith Rockefeller McCormick's children survived her. Their fates were not kind. Harold Fowler McCormick Jeter, called Fowler, was 34 when his mother died. He had married a woman named Fifi Stillman in 1931. She was 15 years his senior, and had previously been divorced from one of the richest banking families in America. That marriage, his sister Muriel would later say, was Fowler's attempt to find a mother who could actually see him. It lasted 15 years. Fowler died in 1973, age 75, having spent most of his later years in seclusion on a Virginia horse farm. Muriel McCormick delayed marriage until her 28th year. Throughout her adult life, she suffered from what her era's doctors called chronic melancholia, a condition now known as major depressive disorder. She lived alone for most of her life, surrounded by her mother's collection of Egyptian relics, which she had inherited but refused to display. She died in 1959 at 56 from a heart condition exacerbated by alcoholism. Mathilda McCormick, as earlier described, died in 1947 at 42, and the granddaughter Mathilde left behind. The daughter she named Anita, born in 1925, would years later give the only on the record interview any descendant of Edith Rockefeller McCormick has ever granted about the family legacy. That interview appeared in a small Swiss historical journal in 1991. In its pages, Anita recounted what her mother Mathilde had confided to her one night in 1944, 3 years before Mathilde's own death. Mathilde told her daughter that her own mother, Edith, had whispered a secret to her on an alpine riding trail that summer of 1922. Words that explained everything: why she had married Max Ozer, why she had stayed in Switzerland, why she had named her daughter Anita, and why none of the other Rockefeller McCormick children would ever truly understand the curse of the brilliant Rockefeller daughters that John D. Rockefeller had once feared was no curse at all. It was a repeating pattern, a design of mothers raised to believe themselves chosen for greatness, yet who proved unable in the ordinary daylight of domestic life to find any glory equal to the inner life they had been promised as girls during nearly half a century after her death. Edith Rockefeller McCormick. On the rare occasions she was remembered, it all endured as an embarrassing footnote in the Rockefeller saga. The eccentric daughter who abandoned her children, the heiress, the woman who banding 79 went through a Swiss bequest. The Rockefeller Archive sent about 400 lekivs and about 4 hergbis parted routes between 1913 and 1923. Those later sealed in a private vault for Zurich for Zurich theory for when vaulted insurance Lacey and product involvement there is over when the first researcher to examine them, a psychoanalytic historian named Sonu Shamdasani, finally published his findings in the early 2000s. The image of Edith Rockefeller McCormick that emerged was almost unrecognizable from the journalistic caricature of the 1920s. She had not been insane. She had not been frivolous. She had been, according to Jung's own private assessment in the surviving clinical notes, one of the 3 most psychologically gifted individuals I have ever treated in my entire career. The claims of past lives were not delusions in Jung's framework. They were archetypal imagery, symbolic expressions of grief, of loss, of a woman trying to construct a personal mythology that would allow her to live alongside the deaths of 2 children, each taken before their 5th birthday. The most devastating revelation in the Jung correspondence was a single passage Edith wrote in March 1916, 15 years after her son John's death, 12 after daughter Edith's. The passage in Jung's handwriting reads, "I do not believe that my children have died. I believe they have hidden themselves inside me. And I believe that if I can become quiet enough, I will be able to hear them again." The maid who had traveled with Edith to Switzerland. A Hungarian woman named Clara Vargas, whose private memoirs were finally published in Budapest in 2000, later confirmed what the Jung papers suggested. Edith had spoken to her dead children aloud every single night for 31 years. What then did Mathilda whisper into her daughter Anita's ear in 1944, 3 years before her own death? It was a question. The very question her own mother, Edith, had asked her on that alpine bridle path on a summer afternoon in 1922. Edith had asked her 16-year-old daughter, "If you could choose any life, would you choose to be my child?" And Mathilda gave no answer to her mother that day. The next spring she married Max Ozer, a man older than her father. A man who would never ask a single thing of her. A presence who would allow her to be still. The camphor-wood chest Edith Rockefeller McCormick had carried for 31 years. The trunk holding the pictures of her dead son John. The tiny Egyptian carvings collected since childhood. And the 4-sentence letter her brother had promised never to read was buried with her in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Westchester County, New York that same autumn of 1932. The answer to her mother's question, the reply Mathilde had been unable to give in 1922, was the confession she finally whispered to her own daughter, Anita, 20, 2 years later, on the eve of Anita's own wedding. "My mother was not a bad woman. My mother was a woman who had lost too much too soon in a family that didn't know how to mourn. She didn't abandon us. She abandoned the world that had taken her children from her. And the only thing I cannot forgive, the only thing, is that she could not see right up to her final breath that she still had 3 of us left." Remember that promise Edith Rockefeller made to herself at 6 years old? The vow her father overheard at that Cleveland, Ohio kitchen table in the fall of 1878. "Father, when I am grown, I shall never count pennies. I shall count only what I give." By the time she died in Suite 1801 of the Drake Hotel, she had given away $35 million. She had less than 9,000 left. She had kept her word. She had married into the largest personal fortune in American history. She had married into the second largest. She had built a palazzo on Lake Michigan, a salon in Chicago, an opera company, a museum pavilion, and a connection to the 20th century's most important psychiatrist. And at the end, in the room where she finally took her last breath, 3 items rested on her nightstand: a photograph, a scarab, and a note her brother would never read. If the story of Edith Rockefeller moved you, then you must hear of another woman whose name was once whispered in the same drawing rooms. A woman who inherited an even larger fortune, who entered into 3 royal marriages, who outlived 4 of her own children, and whose final years made Edith's lonely Chicago death seem almost gentle. Her name was Barbara Hutton. The story of her only son and what she did to him in a Tangier hotel room in 1972 awaits on the screen now. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten women. The ones whose stories history first mocked, then ignored, and whose truths we are only now learning to understand. A new one arrives every week.